They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I am Katie Gorka.
And today we are so happy to introduce you to someone doing really important stuff in the swing states as we are in the run-up to the 2024 election. Victoria Snitsar Churchill is here. She is the 2024 swing state reporter, one of them for the New York Post. They've been doing a great job covering all of the different voter groups, the voting blocks, the swing states, of course, the people who are really going to determine the 2024 election. You can give her a follow at Snits_Churchill. And of course, check out all of her writing at the New York Post. Victoria, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be on the show today.
It's always great to chat with you, and we love your voice. I've been reading a lot. I've been going through a lot of your work, actually, just in getting to know you. And I think it's so important because I'm in very blue California. Katie is in a fun state right now in Virginia because it is a little bit purpley at the moment, a little violet. But these swing states where people are really having to work to get people's votes, I think it's really interesting to study those tactics. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, curious about you. How did you get to be at the New York Post covering these swing states? Tell us a little bit about your story.
Lived in California during high school. So I lived in Northern California, where I graduated high school. Then after that, I went to college at University of Kansas. I studied journalism and then, worked for a few conservative publications in college, kind of freelancing, contributing, writing, interned at Leadership Institute. That's definitely one of my favorite places that I got to go as a campus reform correspondent, kind of exposing liberal bias on college campuses. That was kind of my first portfolio that I ever built. But actually, my first few jobs out of college were working campaigns back in high school and then all through college. In my first couple of years out of college, I worked campaigns in not necessarily swing states, but definitely swing districts. Obviously, Kansas, where I went to college, we had a pretty competitive race in the Kansas 2nd Congressional District a few years ago. It was Congresswoman Lynn Jenkins. She had held the seat for about a decade, and then she was retiring, so it was an open seat, and we had a pretty competitive Democrat, Paul Davis, that ran against former Congressman Steve Watkins. So I was part of that, and that was kind of my first foray into like the really, really, really important races. As a staffer, I was a communications director on that race. And then from there, I actually went on, I worked on the Trump campaign for a couple of years, 2019 and 2020 in Iowa. So that was my first exposure to kind of the presidential campaign level, again, as a staffer, really looking at swing districts. I was in Eastern Iowa. That year was kind of, I think, the formative year for what's really blossomed in that state, where they had representation of one Republican and 3 Democrats in Congress. We flipped it to be 3-1 the other way through a lot of the grassroots work that we did, again, really up and down the ballot. And then, now they have a supermajority pretty much in the state legislature, and then they have all Republican members of Congress now, to the point where, Iowa's not even being talked about as a swing state this year, which I think is super interesting because obviously traditionally it's been kind of the swing state for really about the past 10, 15 years. And through voter registration and really important grassroots tactics like that, states like Iowa, states like really even Florida, long time swing states, they're not really in those categories anymore, which I think is just a testament to the work that grassroots, how important it is, and what really long-term and lasting impact it can have beyond just a single electoral cycle. So kind of through all that, I kind of decided I didn't necessarily want to be super tied to the campaign cycle for my career anymore. So I went into conservative media. I worked at a conservative media startup in Northern Virginia, where I live, not too far from Katie, actually. So my former publication, American Liberty News, as well as the Republican Standard, was founded by a former state executive director of the Virginia Republican Party. So it was kind of a more blog style publication, but again, very in tune with the grassroots. On Facebook, it had about 40,000 followers. So not a super massive like national outlet like I'm at right now, but in terms of a good grassroots news source, again, covering a lot of stories that the mainstream media didn't even really want to look at. That was kind of my first full-time foray into conservative journalism. And then I've also been a commentator through Young Voices, which is partially how I ended up on the show today. So big shout out to them. I've been with them for about a year now, first in their contributors program, and now as a commentator, as I'm kind of writing kind of less opinion pieces, but more just straight journalism in my writing work, but still doing a lot of commentary with them. And then they kind of had this opportunity pop up for somebody in the network to go and join the New York Post. I actually saw it first on my LinkedIn and I was like, there's no way New York Post is going to hire me. And then I saw it pop up again in the kind of this WhatsApp group that we have through Young Voices. And I was like, okay, like I've seen it a couple of times. I might as well apply. And so Virginia actually wasn't on the swing states list when I first applied for the job. And then about a couple of weeks of me being in the job, Trump announces he's going to have over 30 offices here in Virginia. The first lady was here my first couple of weeks on the job. And then obviously everything that we've saw with Virginia's super liberal senators and representatives even not wanting Joe Biden to be president and speaking out against that. I think that's really tossed Virginia into the swing state column for this year, which I'm super excited about. So definitely focusing a lot of my coverage in Virginia as well as Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where I've spent some time as well. So that's kind of how I ended up where I'm at today.
So I would love to dive in a little bit to something that you've been talking about, which is the importance of the grassroots. You talked about your work in Iowa. I just would love for you to unpack that a little bit. What exactly does that look like? I'm asking this partially from my selfish perspective as chair of the Fairfax GOP, because we're really up against it, right? Typically, Republicans here will get 35%. I think in 2020, allegedly, Trump only got 29% of the vote. We're really trying to bump that up, but I'd love to hear more about what was the grassroots work really all about, and what have you seen from your experience? What works?
Well, I think voter registration was really the thing that was drilled down in our heads in early 2019. I mean, like I said, I was there for 14 months, which for being even an embed staffer I don't think it had ever really been done before. I think in the 2020 cycle, we were in the state, kind of earlier and longer than anyone else. Obviously, with Trump being the president at the time, we kind of had that added advantage of where we could staff up and keep hiring people versus the Democrats. They all kind of came through around the time of the caucus and then they left. And then, they had Biden as the nominee and then they ran the campaign from their basement. And then we ended up with the president. So that's what it looked like on their end. But on our end, again, voter registration, a statistic that I was taught, at least back then, was that if you register a voter with your party, and again, Iowa has partisan registration, Virginia obviously doesn't. So I'm not sure quite how replicable this is in Virginia, but in states like Iowa, states like Florida, even like Pennsylvania is another one that's getting a huge look at this year. If you register a voter with your party, if you have like a partisan booth up at an event, for an example, and you register that voter, they are 88% more likely to go and vote for your candidate. So it's pretty much as close as you can get to a 1-to-1 ratio, which, in politics, we talk about predictability in elections and polling and things. Nothing is a guarantee, but that is pretty much as close as you can get to a guarantee that somebody will go out and vote for your guy or gal on the ballot. And so that's something that we looked at in Iowa. We flipped that voter registration. Florida is another great example of that, to the point where the Biden campaign wasn't even looking at it as a swing state, where it's, been one since the 2000 cycle, if not even before then. And then Pennsylvania is another one where they're really looking at that voter registration. I know Scott Pressler with his organization, he's one that I see all the time going out and registering voters to, again, go ahead and basically bank those votes for the candidates. Again, in a state that has partisan voter registration, it's a lot easier because you can mail those universes. And when you talk about targeting and things like that, it's a lot harder to get your messaging out to voters if you don't know that they're planning to vote. But as soon as they are registered to vote, you can bombard them with messaging, which, for people that are very active in getting people to vote early and things like that. It's a great way to both save a campaign that you like money and also make sure that, your vote is in and counted is by going out and voting early. And also, again, it makes sure that you don't get harassed nearly as much, because as soon as that vote is in, it goes ahead and, you're off those lists and things like that. So you aren't getting the texts, the emails, the mailers at your door. But so again, for example, like I said, during the time that I was in Iowa, what our voter registration enabled people to do, it meant that if somebody registered, they were getting hit with mailers and things like that from, the Trump victory team. They were getting hit with mail from the state party. They were getting hit with mail from, each individual candidate, whether that was congressional, statewide. We had Joni Ernst's Senate race. She was running statewide. We had all 4 congressional races. And then we had all the local candidates as well. And, I was in Eastern Iowa, in the University of Iowa, Johnson County area for about 10 months. And then the last 4 months of the campaign, I was in the Des Moines area. And, there, when you talk about spending on media and things like that for a state house candidate, it's really, really expensive for them to go up on the airwaves. So mail, a lot of the times, is one of the only ways they can reach actually the people that they want to talk to. Because when you have, 10 or 12 or even more state house, state Senate seats all in one, for example, like the greater Des Moines area, if you go up on radio, 90% of the people that you're going to hit aren't necessarily going to be the voters that you want to talk to. Mm-hmm. So through mail, that's one of the ways that they target that directly. Cell phone texting, I'm sure we all get hundreds, if not dozens, if not hundreds.
These politicians are obsessed with me. I get a lot of emails.
Exactly. But, even phone numbers, a lot of the times they'll use area codes. And in my early, late teens and early 20s, I had 11 addresses in 6 years. So, my phone number is tied to the Pacific Northwest, where I lived when I first got it. And then since then, I've lived in 4 or 5 different states. So if they're going off my phone number, I actually got it, I think the other month. It was for a teletown hall for my parents' member of Congress, but that is in no way my member of Congress. So even things like cell phone numbers aren't, even though they're used quite extensively, they aren't necessarily as well tuned into obviously someone's geographic address as you would think.
So let's switch it up to today's political landscape, because it's a whole lot different than it was even just like a week and 2 days ago.
Oh my God,
tell us how the coronation of Kamala has been resonating with voters in the swing states, because I know the media is in love. I know the Democrats have all fallen behind Kamala very quickly, but I still feel like this is put on. I don't know if Kamala Harris energizes people. Maybe just because she has a pulse. I don't know. Victoria, what are you hearing from real voters about Kamala Harris as the candidate now?
Well, to me, I think she's not really talking to swing voters in swing states on the issues that they care about. To them, whether you look at polling or whether you go out and actually talk to voters at the doors like I did, I have a piece. I think it should be out in the next couple of days. I partnered up with the Americans for Prosperity chapter in North Carolina when I was down there the other week. And, they actually identified some swing voters through their targeting for me to go out and talk to. And just about every single person that came to the door said that they care about securing the country and securing a future for themselves and their family. A lot of the people that I talked to, given that this was kind of a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the day, they were in their early 50s, maybe early 60s. A lot of them were having children that were out of college. So even issues like education didn't necessarily bank themselves in the top issues that they talked about. Mm-hmm. But when you compare that to trips that Kamala has taken just this month to North Carolina, she didn't mention the border at all. And, obviously we're talking right now about her history as having been appointed the border czar. And again, this is a title not just from right-wing media or right-wing pundits that has been assigned to her. There's this very well documented, even outlets like Axios corrected themselves that they kind of mistakenly bestowed this title upon her just when it became kind of slightly controversial. They're like, oh, actually, we messed up in 2021 and we totally didn't mean to call her that, right? But, she wants to talk about her base issues. And I think that really points to what exact ideology she subscribes to. She wants to be radical on energy. She wants to be radical on what she calls women's rights, right? We call that, the pro-life issue versus they call that women's rights. We call that as, making sure that the next generation actually has an opportunity to be born and to pursue their American dream. And so even though I think what we see a lot of on things like social media is this uprising for Kamala, I think really when it comes to the voters that are going to be making the decisions in key swing states in the electoral college, she's not even talking about their issues. On inflation is another one, I look through, obviously I was at one event that she was at in Greensboro. I watched another one remotely that she did in Fayetteville a couple weeks ago. And then after she does these events, the White House sends out the transcript. So obviously I kind of knew what I experienced being there, but then I double checked it with the official transcript that they sent out. And the only instance of the economy that she brought up was she says, Donald Trump is going to have handouts to billionaires and Joe Biden knows what it's like to be from a middle-class family. That was her only mention of it, which I think is absolutely ludicrous. But I think that also goes to show that she does not have a pulse on what everyday Americans actually care about outside of people that want to yell and scream on TikTok and, people that are funding her campaign. Those are kind of the two sects that she has tapped into, but I don't think that translates to actual key votes that are going to make a difference in these states.
Wow, I love that insight. So, one of the parts of the narrative that's being used to theoretically show that she's got all this backing and support and excitement is the amount of money that she's been able to raise in just the first few days of having been announced, right? I mean, I think it was $90 million after a couple days, and maybe now it's up over $200 million. But at the same time, we've got this breaking story that there is growing evidence that there might be malfeasance being conducted through Act Blue. So James O'Keefe broke a story yesterday. This is a woman from Annapolis that he spoke to who allegedly contributed over 1,000 times to Act Blue in 2022 for a total of $18,000. For that to have been true, that means she would have had to donate 3 times a day, every day for the whole year.
It's dedication.
Yeah. And she actually said, no, that's impossible. That wasn't me. Here in Virginia, our Attorney General, Jason Miyares, has said he's aware of this and he's investigating it. And we're seeing a growing number of stories pop up around the country where you're getting hundreds of theoretical donations channeled through like one person's account. Are you tracking this story at all? Are you hearing much about this?
So I just want to take a look at how these Act Blue donation pages are actually structured. A lot of the times they'll do a campaign like swing congressional districts or swing Senate districts. And so if somebody has say they want to donate $100, they can choose an option for that donation to be split. So that one-time kind of act can go out and be actually $10 donations. So again, when you look at FEC records, which are all public knowledge, you can look up, if you have a neighbor, you don't know who they're voting for, you can look up and see, you can look up your city and their name and see if they've ever donated to any political candidate. Those donations are all public. Things like campaign committees, they don't necessarily have to publish or itemize those donations under $100, but when it's done virtually through the internet, through something like Act Blue, it automatically goes and, delivers you any kind of information on the donor, their job, etc. So that's how, even you get these articles of like from this company, I think it was, for example, to no surprise, like some of the biggest donors to Democrats, for example, in the 2020 cycle, they were all University of California professors, like who would have thought? And so that's kind of where stories like that come from. But when you go out and you make this donation, it counts it as 10 individual donations. And then there's another box that donors can check, which is to make that recurring. Mm-hmm. So that's where you get these numbers of like, well, they have to donate every day. And it's like, no, if they're donating to 25 congressional districts once a month, that's where you get those averages. And so that kind of helps put those numbers a little bit more into perspective. But a lot of the times these donation pages autofill, so they auto-select that you want to donate to all these candidates and that you want to make it recurring. And then, a lot of people don't realize these recurring charges that come out on their credit cards and things like that until stories like that come out and they're like, oh, wait, And, I mean, I know my generation, we do it with things like Apple subscriptions, right? You go and you have something that's popped up, and then you go out and you check and you're like, wait, what have I been spending $39.99 on for the past 7 months? And then you kind of go back and you figure out what it is. And so, in digital payment world, these ideas of things that you subscribe to and end up paying on accident or accidentally on purpose, I guess, for months on end, that in itself isn't necessarily, malicious, because it's not just used in politics. But I think that helps bring some context to it. But when it amounts to tens and hundreds and thousands of dollars, that's something where I think it does raise a red flag. Obviously, another reason for that is because there's contribution limits to how much you can give to candidates. So, I think this year it's like right around $6,000. I think it's like $5,800, something like that. It goes up every cycle, in part due to things like inflation, I'm sure. Looking at kind of that raw dollar amount of how much that money actually goes, whether you're spending it on advertising or campaign staff. 10 years ago, I was getting paid a lot more or a lot less doing grassroots than I would be if I were to take on those kinds of jobs today. So that, again, is things to factor in account. But if you are surpassing those donation limits, that is definitely a big red flag. But again, I think that's kind of one of the ways that they try to mitigate that, is to spread it out amongst as many candidates as they can. And so with Act Blue, that's one of the reasons why this was set up this way, is that you can have these liberal mega donors, whether that's in San Francisco or in New York. If anybody is still living there, they're probably quite left, because it seems like the majority of the sane people there have left New York. So, that money is really being made in one liberal metropolis, if they will want to paint it that way. And then it's being spread to all these districts. I know in Virginia's 2nd Congressional District is one that we're looking at. Obviously, Jen Kiggins, the incumbent, she's got a race against Missy Cotter-Smassel. Another one in Virginia is Eugene Vidman. I think he's a prime example of this. Money from all over the country pouring into a really key race. Even a lot of Democrats here in the state were really not happy with the fact that he ended up being their nominee, or the fact that he was even running. There's a guy by the name of Josh. I'm trying to remember his last name right now. It is totally escaping me. But he is a member of the House from the Fredericksburg area. Josh Cole, there he goes. Sorry, it just came back to me. Josh Cole, he's a member of the House from the Fredericksburg area. And he was like, who is this Vindman guy? Like, he's basically a carpetbagger. Why is he running? And he ran against a lot of Democrats that are either in the state house or the House of Delegates or the Virginia Senate. And he won in large part to millions of dollars that came in just because Vindman was obviously a key figure in the Trump impeachment. So he gained some national name ID. And so they were all able to funnel their dollars into him. And now that he's passed the primary, he's using that against Derek Anderson, who's a Republican that's running for that seat. So it's definitely a system that the Democrats thought up, and now it's up to AGs like Miara's that are looking into it. I think the exact post from Charlie Kirk was like, this activity is happening in all 50 states. Obviously, we've got Republican AGs in a bunch of these states, so they need to look into it. And so I'm interested to see what Miara's is going to come up with, if anything. And obviously,
it's always good to get Ken Paxton involved from Texas too. He's always a bulldog when it comes to that, which I always enjoy. Victoria Churchill is with us. She is a swing state reporter, 2024 swing state reporter for the New York Post. And I know really you're paying a lot of attention to Pennsylvania and to North Carolina. And both of those states have made some news this week in the hunt for Kamala Harris's new vice presidential pick. So you've got Roy Cooper from North Carolina, the governor, who said he's out. He doesn't want anything to do with the race for whatever reason. I'm interested in your comments on that. And then Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, who's the governor there, who's kind of an odds-on favorite, I think, or at least one of the top names on the list for Kamala Harris to choose from. And he's got a sexual assault scandal. Can you talk about what you're hearing, not only from voters about who might complete that ticket for them, and then also just some of those reasons for either jumping out with Roy Cooper or the scandal around Josh Shapiro?
Well, I think when we look at Cooper, I actually thought he was going to be more favorable to be a pick. I'm interested to know exactly why he dropped out. I think we'll probably find out more details on that. But at those two events that I talked about earlier, that Kamala Harris did in North Carolina, he had kind of become a major in-state surrogate for her. He says, he's known her since the time they were both attorneys general, himself in North Carolina and herself in California. So they've got a long-standing relationship, friendship. Maybe there's a job he would look at more intently at a potential Harris administration. So possibly that might be what he's holding out for. And then another one of the things that was raised was, obviously right now we've got North Carolina's lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. He's running for governor because Cooper is at the end of his term. And there was kind of some ambiguity, I guess, about laws in North Carolina that if a governor leaves the state, his powers are kind of transferred to the lieutenant governor. I think it's meant more of kind of emergency situations and things like that, but there is some ambiguity of whether if Cooper was to leave the state to be campaigning for vice president on the trail with Harris, that if that would kind of make Robinson the de facto governor and if he could do any executive orders or things like that. So that was kind of another part of the conversation of Cooper basically saying, I'm going to stay put where I'm at right now. But again, I do think he has done a lot for the Harris campaign. I've seen some of it myself at some of these events. And I think even though he, obviously now that he's kind of bowed out, he won't be on the ticket, I think he's still going to play a role in her reelection as he did when it was the Biden-Harris campaign. And I think he's going to be a top advisor to her. North Carolina is obviously a state that Democrats are spending a lot of time in, evidenced by the fact that Kamala has been there twice in a month. And I think it's also a state that Republicans are desperate to hold on to. I think, Trump won it by, I think it was like 1.5% or something in 2020. So they're doing all that they can to really lay that solid grassroots infrastructure. I talked to a couple of the local activists. Actually, I've got a story up on my profile with the Post. I talked to them the day before his rally in Charlotte last week, just about kind of some of the efforts that they're going through there. So that's a great read if folks want to check that out. And then looking at Pennsylvania, I think Shapiro would be a pretty solid pick for her. Obviously, he's going to try and counteract the Rust Belt vote that J.D. Vance is bringing to the Trump ticket, or at least hopefully bringing. One of Vance's first couple of stops as a solo VP candidate, they were in Ohio and then in Radford, Virginia, where I
were they well attended, Victoria?
The Radford event, yes, yeah, they kind of had people lined up basically equal with what we call the press pen, where the press is at all these events. Then they opened up kind of a back drape to let people fill in that had lined up. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. I heard that at his first event, some jokes kind of landed a little bit flat. I wasn't there. One of my colleagues was there. Our Ohio reporter, Joe, he was at that event. And then I was at his second event. So I think, he was a little bit rough around the edges. But again, it was kind of his first day on the job, really, as the official pick, doing these solo rallies. But what I do think is interesting is that the more recent events we've seen is Trump appearing with Vance. So I don't know if that was kind of a strategic decision, maybe thinking that these solo events might not be the best way to go. And it'll be interesting, also to see if that's a play that Harris makes as well with whoever her VP pick is, whether they're appearing together as kind of a unified front, or if whoever it is going to be going off and doing their own events. Harris's events were definitely not as well attended. I think it was her actual first event that she did, I believe it was in Wisconsin, as the official nominee. She touted having over, I think it was like 3,500 people versus Trump rallies or tens of thousands of people, even more than that. If you look at events that he's done, even in Pennsylvania, right? He did an event in the Philly suburbs. He did one in New Jersey. It's absolutely wild, these crowds that turn out for Trump, wait a day or more in advance to get in. Obviously, he always talks about the front row Joes, the supporters that show up to every event of his. So he's definitely got a dedicated following of people that are going to show up. And, I think that's kind of another reason why he even wants to do outdoor rallies again, despite what happened in Butler, because he wants there to basically be no limit to these crowds that can assemble to support him.
So before we end, because we're almost out of time, but I'd love to talk a little bit about the youth vote. So I know you because you were involved with the Young Republicans here in Northern Virginia. But I think it's been really interesting. So Trump has gone with a significantly younger VP pick, and with Kamala Harris now as the presidential pick for the Democrats, she is significantly younger than Biden. With these changes, are you seeing any shift in the younger vote? And I just also have to throw in the fact, I think it was the Wall Street Journal that had a very interesting article the other day, not telling us anything we didn't know, but it was interesting to see it in print, how politics is really dividing the sexes, that we're seeing young men go conservative, young women go liberal. But I'm just curious, are you seeing any of that? And what are you seeing with young people out there in the swing states?
Well, there was another poll that came out again, kind of as soon as Kamala was made the presumptive nominee, that Trump was actually up about 20%. I think the exact number was 17 or 18% with young voters, with, him getting in the 50s and her getting in the low to mid 30s, which I think is just a testament to the fact that, again, kind of Kamala's rhetoric, it does well on social media, but when it actually talks to the issues, young people being concerned about pursuing their American dream, building for the future, she doesn't have solutions because, again, she's not talking about those issues. And also it's interesting to note that obviously in polling, younger voters are typically 18 to 34, which is quite a large swath of age and probably some very diverse types of people living very diverse types of lives in all of those age demographics. Even for myself, I'm in my late 20s. I'm 27 right now. I have a sister that's about to be a freshman in college. We have very different priorities and we're 9 years apart. And so taking that swath to almost 20 years, people are in very different life stages. Obviously, you've got people that are just out of high school. Some people choose to go to college. Some people don't. Got people getting their first jobs again, whether that's right out of high school in their late teens or in their early 20s. Obviously got people that stay in college longer. Some of them, I've got some people my age that still haven't gotten their first full-time job if they've if they've pursued education throughout the number of years. And so I think when you look at people that are actually out of whatever education they're doing, they're in their first few years of their career, they know the difference between what was even 4 or 5 years ago when they were getting that first job or that second job and where they're at right now. Even in my own case, I've had a few different jobs. I've always looked at, obviously getting that next level of salary. And, I feel like I can barely keep up, but I have the option of kind of looking and pivoting and doing something a little bit different. I talked to a guy at the North Carolina rally. He was just about my age. He's a GIS technician, so he does mapping for a lot of underground lines that go in. And, he says that he's seen his paycheck go smaller, not go as far. And, he's in a very highly skilled job that is very much in demand. Not a lot of people know what he knows how to do. So he's stayed with the same company, at least based on our conversation. It seemed to me like he stayed with the same company his first few years out of college. And, he says that he really feels the plight of Bidenflation hitting him. And that's, despite the fact that in North Carolina, they have a Republican legislature that's been doing everything that they can to kind of stem the effects of what is happening nationally, stem that for North Carolinians as much as they can. They're working on reducing their state income tax to be in line with a lot more southern states, maybe even one day to the level of Florida, but I think they're looking at being at about 2.5% for state income tax is kind of their goal. So even with good policies at the state level, there's still a very limited amount what you can do if what's going on nationally is the complete mess that we've seen over the past 3.5 years. But, even from my conversations with younger voters, I think they are optimistic. They're optimistic about going out and turning out for common sense conservative policies, not, again, this rhetoric that we're seeing from Kamala, which is very siloed and very much playing to the base, which, again, is going to be loud, but I don't know how massive that base is and how in tune people are. I also think that a lot of people are finally starting to pay attention to the electoral season. Typically just from working in grassroots, a lot of people don't pay attention until this point in the year or later. Obviously, we had the Trump-Biden debate. I think that woke a lot of people up in mid-June, which is a lot earlier than what people actually pay attention to typically. And then obviously since the debate, we had the pushback against Biden leading to him dropping out, now the Kamala presidency. And so I think over the past, what's it been, 3 weeks? It's crazy. It's been a crazy 3 weeks. Definitely flown by. But over the past 3 weeks, we're seeing a lot more people waking up. And so I think, the media is doing everything they can to play that into Kamala's hands of like, oh, look, here's this new shiny object that we're just going to polish up and present on a pedestal to you. But
they're calling it the Harris honeymoon, but we'll see how long that lasts, right?
Well,
and I think what really matters is what you've touched on, and that is she really addressing the issues that are important to the voters that she needs in order to win, or is President Trump doing a better job of that? And I think probably we'd agree that President Trump is doing a better job, but we'll see. It's going to be a long couple of months. But Victoria, we appreciate you. We're going to check in with you again just to see how things are going out on the campaign trail. Victoria Snitsar Churchill was with us. She is the 2024 Swing State reporter for the New York Post. You can check them out, all of her work at the New York Post, of course, and on social media for her at Snits_Churchill. And Victoria, thanks so much for being with us. We thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to do a couple of things for us. Will you please, if you are enjoying the podcast, give us a 5-star rating, share with your friends, and connect on all of our different platforms. SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Just look for Happy Women wherever you get your podcasts as well. And get Katie's new book. It's called Next Gen Marxism. You can get more information at katiegorka.org. You can also follow her, search her, Catherine Gorka on Facebook. You can find me, Jennifer Horn Radio, on Instagram and Facebook, and Jennifer Horn on Truth and on X. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.